They laughed when a broken veteran inherited a useless mountain ridge, until his German shepherd uncovered the secret that fed an entire valley through the deadliest winter in 40 years. When Travis Cole arrived at Starvation Ridge, people in Elk River shook their heads. The place had a reputation. Nothing grew there, the wind never stopped, and winters cut the valley off from the world. But Travis wasn't alone. Beside him stood Atlas, the German shepherd who had followed him home from war. No one expected a wounded veteran and his loyal dog to change the fate of the entire town. Until the mountain revealed a secret hidden deep in its stone. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The first thing you should know about land in the high country of Colorado is that not all mountains are the same. Some mountains feed towns. Some hold rivers and timber and grazing pastures that keep people alive. But every valley has at least one place locals avoid. A ridge where nothing grows right, where winter wind cuts deeper, where storms linger longer than anywhere else. In Elk River, Colorado, that place was called Starvation Ridge. People had called it that for nearly a century. Long before Travis Cole ever set foot there, ranchers had tried to graze cattle on its thin grass and failed. Farmers had tried to clear small fields, only to find the soil too rocky and stubborn. Snow piled higher there than anywhere else in the valley, drifting deep against the slopes like the mountain itself was trying to bury the land. By the time Travis inherited it, most people in town spoke of Starvation Ridge the way they spoke of old ghost mines or collapsed barns, something from the past that nobody bothered with anymore. Travis Cole arrived on a gray afternoon in early September. The pickup he drove was old enough to rattle when the road turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt when the road climbed toward the ridge. Aspen leaves shimmered pale gold along the slopes, and the air smelled like pine needles and cold stone. Beside him in the passenger seat sat a German shepherd the color of burnt copper and black shadow. Atlas. The dog watched the mountains through the windshield with steady eyes, ears alert, body calm in the way working dogs always are. His chest rose and fell slowly, like he understood exactly where they were going. Travis didn't. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the truck climbed higher. The road twisted through pine and spruce until the valley disappeared behind the trees. He had spent 15 years in the Army, 2 deployments to Iraq. Too many patrols through towns where the air always felt 1 second away from exploding. But driving up that quiet mountain road made something in his chest feel just as tight. Maybe because silence had its own kind of noise. The truck crested the final bend, and the land opened in front of them. 15 acres of uneven ground stretched across the ridge. Wind bent the grass low against the earth. Pines leaned crooked as if the storms had pushed them sideways for decades. Near the center of the property stood a cabin. Calling it a cabin was generous. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. The porch rails leaned outward like tired bones. One window hung crooked in its frame, and the paint on the wood siding had faded to a tired gray. Behind it, half hidden by trees and stone, the mountain rose steeply. Somewhere in that slope, according to the papers the lawyer had handed him, was an abandoned stone storage room carved into the rock sometime before World War II. The lawyer had cleared his throat while reading the will. 15 acres on Starvation Ridge, he had said carefully. A small residence and 1 stone structure of no documented commercial value. No commercial value. The phrase had echoed in the quiet office. Travis remembered the way the secretary had glanced up from her desk, curiosity flickering in her eyes, like she was waiting to see if he'd laugh or shake his head. He hadn't done either, because the truth was, he barely knew the man who had left him the land. Uncle Raymond Cole. A quiet relative his mother rarely mentioned. A man who had apparently lived alone on this ridge for nearly 40 years. Travis had never visited, never even written. And yet Raymond Cole had left the entire property to him. The truck rolled to a stop beside the cabin. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. For a moment, Travis didn't move. The wind swept across the ridge, carrying the smell of pine sap and distant snow from the higher peaks. Somewhere below in the valley, a hawk cried once before the sound faded into the distance. Atlas shifted in his seat. Then the dog stood and nudged Travis's arm with his nose. The gesture was gentle but firm. A reminder. You're here. Travis exhaled slowly. Yeah, he muttered. His voice sounded rough in the quiet cab. Let's see what we got. They stepped out together. The air on the ridge felt colder than it had in the valley below. A steady wind moved through the trees, rustling branches in a constant whisper. Atlas circled the truck once, nose low to the ground, reading the sense of the land the way a soldier reads a map. Travis walked toward the cabin. Each step stirred small puffs of dust from the dry soil. The porch boards creaked under his boots as he climbed the 3 worn steps. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood, cold stone, and something else Travis couldn't quite place. Not rot, not mold, just the quiet scent of a place that had been closed for a long time. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains and spread across the floorboards in pale strips. The room was simple. A wooden table, a cast-iron stove, a narrow bed pushed against one wall. No clutter, no decorations. Whoever had lived here had kept things plain. Atlas padded inside behind him, nails clicking softly on the wood floor. The dog moved slowly through the room, sniffing corners and walls before settling near the door. Watching. Always watching. Travis walked to the small kitchen counter and ran a hand along the surface. Dust coated his fingers. He wiped them on his jeans. So this is it, he murmured. 15 acres, a broken cabin, a mountain ridge nobody wanted. Most people in Elk River had made that clear. When Travis stopped at the only gas station in town earlier that morning, a man in a denim jacket had asked where he was headed. Starvation Ridge, Travis had said. The man had laughed once. Not cruelly, just the way people laugh when something sounds ridiculous. Ain't nothing up there but wind and rocks, the man said. Winter hits that ridge first and leaves last. Then he nodded toward Atlas. Dog's gonna like it, though. Plenty of deer trails. Travis had nodded. He hadn't mentioned the nightmares. The sudden flashes of sound that turned quiet rooms into war zones inside his head. Or the way Atlas was the only reason he slept through most nights now. That kind of truth didn't belong in gas station conversations. A sharp thump echoed outside. Travis turned instinctively, heart hammering. Atlas was already moving. The dog slipped through the door and bounded off the porch. Travis followed a moment later. Atlas had stopped near the edge of the clearing. The shepherd stood perfectly still, staring toward the trees that climbed the slope behind the cabin. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the wind shifted. The trees rustled. Nothing else happened. Atlas finally relaxed and looked back at Travis, tail wagging once. False alarm. Travis rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. The tension in his chest slowly eased. He looked across the ridge again. The land stretched quiet and empty under the afternoon sky. 15 acres. No neighbors in sight. No traffic. No city noise. Just wind, trees, and the distant mountains rising blue against the horizon. Most people saw nothing of value here, but Travis had learned something in the army. Sometimes the quiet places were the ones that kept you alive. He looked down at Atlas. "Well, partner," he said softly. "Looks like it's just you and me." Atlas wagged his tail again. The wind swept across Starvation Ridge, bending the grass low against the earth. And somewhere deep inside the mountain behind the cabin, something waited in the stone that neither man nor dog had discovered yet. That first night on the ridge was colder than Travis expected. By the time the sun dropped behind the mountains, the temperature fell fast. The sky turned the color of iron, and a thin layer of frost crept across the porch boards outside the cabin. Inside, Travis lit a small fire in the old cast-iron stove he had found in the corner. The metal groaned softly as the heat returned to it for the first time in years. Atlas lay on the wooden floor nearby, watching the door. Always watching. Travis sat at the table with a dented metal mug in his hands. Coffee. Strong and bitter. The kind he had learned to drink overseas because it kept him awake when sleep wasn't safe. The cabin creaked as the wind pushed against the walls. It was an ordinary sound, but to Travis, the noise landed somewhere deeper. His shoulders tightened. His eyes moved toward the window without thinking. A loose branch scraped the side of the cabin. In an instant, his body reacted, heart racing, breath shallow, muscles tight. The room was gone. In its place was another night, another building half a world away. Sand blowing against concrete walls, radios whispering in the dark. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen, and nobody knew exactly when. The mug trembled slightly in his hands. Then Atlas moved. The dog stood slowly and walked over, pressing his heavy head against Travis's knee. No barking, no panic, just wait. Warm, steady, real. Travis exhaled through clenched teeth. His hand dropped to the dog's neck, fingers curling into the thick fur. "I'm here," he whispered quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it to the dog or to himself. Atlas remained still until Travis's breathing slowed. Only then did the shepherd settle down beside the chair again. The silence returned. Outside, the wind continued to move through the trees. Inside the cabin, the fire popped softly. Travis leaned back in the chair and stared at the flames. War had ended for everyone else 3 years ago. For him, it had never really stopped. He had come home with a purple heart and a stack of paperwork that said words like post-traumatic stress and recommended civilian reintegration. But paperwork didn't stop the sounds. Car doors slamming, fireworks, thunderstorms. Sometimes even silence could set it off. The army doctor had told him something once before he left the base hospital. "You're not broken," the man had said gently. "Your brain just learned to survive in a place where danger came fast." Travis remembered staring at the hospital wall while the doctor spoke. He hadn't argued, but he hadn't believed it either. Survival didn't feel like survival when sleep came in pieces and your mind replayed the same moments over and over. The only thing that helped was Atlas. The dog had been assigned to his unit during Travis's second deployment. Atlas had been trained to detect explosives, calm under pressure, focused even when gunfire cracked through the streets. But somewhere along the line, the dog had started watching Travis more closely than the roads.
watching for the small signs. The way his breathing changed before panic hit. The way his hands shook when memories surfaced. When Travis left the service, Atlas left with him. The paperwork had taken months.
The bond had taken minutes. Travis finished his coffee and stood. The floor creaked under his boots as he walked toward the small window beside the door. Outside, darkness had swallowed the ridge. Only the pale line of snow far up the mountain reflected faint moonlight. Atlas lifted his head. His ears twitched. Travis noticed it immediately. "What is it?" The dog didn't bark. He simply stood and walked toward the door. His posture changed slightly, alert, focused. The way working dogs move when something catches their attention. Travis opened the door. Cold air rushed inside. Atlas stepped onto the porch and scanned the darkness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a faint rustle came from the trees behind the cabin. Probably deer. The mountains were full of them. Atlas relaxed slightly, tail flicking once. Travis stepped outside, letting the cold air clear his head. The sky above Starvation Ridge was wide and black, scattered with stars so bright they almost looked close enough to touch. In Iraq, the sky had been different. Dusty, hazy, always glowing faintly with distant city lights or flares. Here the stars were sharp and endless. He breathed slowly, letting the mountain air settle into his lungs. Below the ridge, the valley lights of Elk River shimmered faintly through the trees. A small town. 2 gas stations, 1 grocery store. A diner that closed by 8 most nights. Earlier that afternoon, Travis had stopped there before driving up the mountain. The diner smelled like fried onions and coffee. 3 old men had been sitting at the counter when he walked in. They had gone quiet when they saw Atlas. One of them finally asked, "You the new fella heading up to Raymond Cole's place?" Travis nodded. "Guess that's me." The oldest man had chuckled and shook his head. "Son, that ridge is where farms go to die." Another man added, "Snow stacks up there like nowhere else. You'll be digging your truck out till May." None of them sounded cruel, just certain, like they were stating a simple fact. Travis finished his meal, paid the bill, and walked out without arguing. Because arguing wouldn't change anything. People in small towns already knew what they believed. He looked around the ridge again now. The land stretched quiet beneath the stars. Wind moved through the tall grass in slow waves. Atlas returned to the porch and sat beside him. The dog's shoulder pressed lightly against Travis's leg. Together they stood there a long time, man and dog. 2 survivors trying to learn what peace looked like. Finally, Travis spoke softly. "Well, Atlas, they say nothing grows up here." Atlas tilted his head slightly. Travis gave a faint smile. "Maybe that's exactly what we need." The wind swept across Starvation Ridge again. Cold, endless, patient. And behind the cabin, hidden somewhere in the dark stone of the mountain, the ridge held its secrets a little longer. Morning came slowly to Starvation Ridge. The sun didn't rise over the cabin the way it did in the valley. The mountains blocked the first light, leaving the ridge wrapped in pale gray shadow long after dawn had reached the town below. Travis stepped out onto the porch with a metal mug of coffee warming his hands. The air had the sharp bite of early autumn, the kind that hinted winter wasn't far away. Atlas trotted ahead of him into the clearing. The shepherd's nose dropped instantly to the ground, reading the land. Every scent told a story. Deer, rabbit, pine, cold stone. Travis leaned against the porch railing and watched him. It had been 3 days since they arrived. 3 quiet days. During the daylight hours, Travis repaired the cabin where he could. He tightened loose boards, patched a cracked window with scrap wood, and cleared fallen branches from the small path leading toward the trees. At night, the wind still tested the cabin walls, but each night felt a little easier. Atlas moved with purpose across the clearing, tail low, ears forward. Something had caught his attention. Travis noticed it immediately. "Find something?" Atlas didn't answer, of course, but he trotted toward the slope behind the cabin where the land rose steeply into the mountain. Travis followed. The hillside was covered in loose rock and thick brush. Moss clung to shaded stones, and the ground smelled damp beneath the dry leaves. Atlas stopped near a cluster of large boulders. Then he began digging. Not casually. Not the playful scraping dogs sometimes do. This was focused, deliberate. Dirt sprayed behind him as his paws worked faster, claws tearing through loose soil and small rocks. Travis frowned. "What's got into you?" Atlas kept digging. The shepherd paused only long enough to sniff the ground again before attacking the same spot with renewed energy. Within seconds, a shallow hole had formed between two large stones. Travis stepped closer. "Easy, buddy." He crouched beside the dog and brushed aside loose dirt with his hands. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just rock. Then his fingers touched something smoother. Stone. But not the rough, natural kind scattered across the slope. This surface was flat. Cut. Travis leaned forward, clearing more dirt away. The shape became clearer. A line in the rock. Straight. Too straight to be natural. Atlas whined softly and scratched again. More soil slid away. The outline of a doorway slowly appeared beneath the dirt and moss. Travis sat back on his heels, heart beating faster. "Well, I'll be." The opening had once been sealed by wooden boards, but time had rotted most of them away. Only fragments remained between the stone frame. The rest was packed with earth and fallen debris. Travis brushed dirt from the stone edge and looked closer. Old chisel marks ran along the sides. Someone had carved this opening into the mountain decades ago, maybe longer. Atlas barked once and pawed at the base again. "All right," Travis said quietly. "Let's see what you found." He returned to the cabin and grabbed a rusted shovel leaning against the porch wall. Back at the hillside, he began clearing the packed dirt. The soil near the entrance had hardened over time. Each shovel strike loosened only a small amount at first. But little by little, the opening widened. Atlas stayed beside him, nose pressed close to the ground, as if making sure the hole didn't disappear again. After 20 minutes, Travis uncovered enough space to see inside. Darkness filled the narrow gap. Cool air flowed outward. Not cold like the mountain wind. Different. Still. Heavy with the smell of stone. Travis leaned forward and shined a small flashlight through the opening. The beam revealed a narrow stone passage stretching into the mountain. Walls cut smooth by tools. Not natural. Built. Atlas stepped closer, tail wagging slowly now. The dog seemed almost pleased with himself. Travis laughed quietly. "Guess you weren't chasing squirrels after all." He widened the hole further until the entrance was large enough to step through. Loose dirt crumbled beneath his boots as he crouched and ducked inside. Atlas followed immediately. The air inside the tunnel felt cooler, cleaner somehow. The flashlight beam moved across the walls, revealing rows of old tool marks carved deep into the stone. The passage ran straight for about 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Travis stepped carefully into the room. Dust covered the ground. but the space itself was intact. Stone shelves lined the walls. Metal hooks hung from a wooden beam overhead. In the corner sat an old table made from thick planks darkened by age. The chamber smelled faintly of earth and cold rock. Atlas sniffed every corner of the room with intense curiosity. Travis lowered the flashlight slowly. "What the hell were you using this for, Uncle Raymond?" He ran a hand along one of the stone shelves. The rock felt colder than the air outside. Strangely steady. Not freezing, but cool in a way that didn't change. His mind began fitting the pieces together. A stone room carved into the mountain, hidden from sunlight, protected from wind. A place like this would stay the same temperature year-round. Storage. Old mountain storage. Before electricity. Before refrigerators. People in the mountains had needed places like this to keep food from spoiling. Travis turned the flashlight beam across the floor again. Something else caught his eye. Near the back wall sat a wooden chest. Dust coated the lid, but the hinges still looked solid. He walked over and knelt beside it. The lid creaked softly when he opened it. Inside were several items wrapped in cloth. A rusted hunting knife, a pair of old work gloves, and beneath them, a notebook. The leather cover was cracked with age but still intact. Travis opened it carefully. The first page was filled with neat handwriting. He read the title slowly. Mountain Cold Storage Methods. Atlas sat beside him quietly, watching. Travis turned to the next page. Drawings filled the paper. Hooks, racks, fire pits, smoke channels. Detailed notes covered the margins. Methods for preserving meat, drying venison, smoking pork, using mountain air and stone chambers to keep food from spoiling through winter. Travis let out a low whistle. "Looks like you knew what you were doing, Uncle Raymond." He closed the notebook and looked around the chamber again. The hooks, the shelves, the stone walls. It all suddenly made sense. This wasn't just a random cave. It was a storage room, a mountain freezer, hidden in the ridge. Atlas wagged his tail once, as if pleased with the discovery. Travis scratched behind the dog's ears. "Well, partner," he said quietly, "looks like you just found the most useful thing on this whole mountain." Outside, the wind continued to move across Starvation Ridge. But deep inside the mountain, the air remained still, cool, patient, and waiting to be used again. The cool air inside the stone chamber wrapped around Travis like the inside of a cellar. It wasn't freezing, not the biting kind of cold that made your teeth chatter. It was steady, quiet, the kind of cold that felt like it had been there for years, maybe decades. Atlas padded across the stone floor, sniffing each corner of the chamber with careful curiosity. His nails clicked softly against the rock, the sound echoing faintly in the narrow space. Travis stood slowly and swept the flashlight beam across the room again. The more he looked, the more details revealed themselves. The hooks hanging from the beam weren't random. They were spaced evenly, each one strong enough to hold weight. Old smoke stains darkened the stone above them. On the far wall, a narrow slit cut through the rock led upward into darkness. Ventilation. Someone had built this place with purpose. Travis knelt beside the stone table in the center of the chamber. The surface was worn smooth in places, rough in others where knives or tools had left faint scratches over the years. "This wasn't just storage," he murmured. Atlas looked at him. Travis tapped the table lightly. This was work. He opened the notebook again, flipping slowly through the pages. The handwriting inside was steady and careful. The ink had faded in places, but most of the words were still clear. Drawings filled the margins, hooks arranged in rows, measurements for hanging meat, notes about wind direction and temperature. One line caught his attention. Cold mountain air preserves better than ice if the chamber breathes right. Travis leaned back against the stone wall. His eyes moved between the notebook and the room around him. Then the realization settled in. This whole place, it's a smokehouse. Atlas tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for the next instruction. Travis chuckled quietly. "Well," he said, scratching behind the dog's ear, "not exactly the kind the grocery store uses." He stood and walked toward the narrow slit in the wall. When he shined the flashlight inside, he saw the passage angling upward through the stone. Air moved through it, slow but steady. A natural draft pulling cool mountain air through the chamber. The kind of airflow hunters used for curing meat before electricity ever existed. Travis exhaled slowly. "Uncle Raymond, you old mountain fox." He turned the page of the notebook again. This time, he read carefully. "Venison strips, hang for 7 days. Elk, 14 days if the air stays dry. Keep the fire pit outside the entrance. Smoke must stay cool." Travis lowered the notebook. Atlas sat beside him patiently. "You realize what this means, right?" The dog wagged his tail once. Travis laughed softly. "Yeah, I guess you do." He closed the notebook and tucked it under his arm. Then he stepped back outside the chamber. Sunlight had shifted while they were underground. The slope behind the cabin glowed with warm afternoon light now, the tops of the trees swaying gently in the wind. Travis filled in just enough dirt around the entrance to make the opening safer to walk through. Then he returned to the cabin. Atlas followed close behind, glancing back toward the hillside once before trotting through the door. Inside, Travis placed the notebook on the table. He opened a cabinet and found a small bag of jerky he had brought from town. It wasn't great jerky. Too salty, too dry. The kind made by machines in factories far away. He chewed slowly while flipping through the notebook again. Each page told a story. Recipes, instructions, measurements. But there were also notes scribbled between the lines. Weather conditions, mountain temperatures, even small sketches showing how smoke moved through the stone chamber. Uncle Raymond hadn't just used the ridge. He had studied it, understood it. Atlas lay down beside the table, resting his chin on his paws. The dog watched Travis quietly. After a while, Travis stood and grabbed his jacket. "Come on," he said. Atlas's ears lifted instantly. They walked down the slope behind the cabin again. This time, Travis carried a coil of rope and a small hunting knife. The forest beyond the ridge was thick with pine and aspen. Deer trails crisscrossed the underbrush like faint lines drawn across the mountain. Atlas moved ahead of him, nose low. 20 minutes later, the dog froze. His body stiffened. Travis recognized the signal immediately. Easy. He crouched beside a fallen log and followed the direction of the dog's gaze. A mule deer buck stood about 40 yards away between two trees. The animal lifted its head slowly. The wind was still in Travis's favor. Atlas didn't move, didn't bark, just waited. Travis raised the rifle he had slung across his back. One breath, then another. The shot cracked through the forest. Birds scattered from the trees. The buck dropped instantly. Atlas bounded forward, tail high but disciplined enough not to touch the animal. Travis walked over and knelt beside it. "Good work," he said quietly. He placed a hand on the deer's side for a moment. Old habits. Respect for the animal. Then he began the careful work of field dressing. The sun dipped lower by the time Travis dragged the deer back toward the cabin. It took 2 trips and a lot of rope. Atlas stayed close the entire time, circling the clearing while Travis worked. When the meat was finally prepared, Travis stood beside the stone entrance again. He hesitated. Then he carried the first section inside. The chamber smelled the same as before. Cold, clean, ancient. He hung the meat carefully on one of the old hooks. The weight held. The air moved quietly around it. Travis stepped back. Atlas sat beside him, watching the hanging venison sway slightly in the dim light. "Guess we'll find out," Travis said. The wind outside whispered through the trees. Inside the mountain, the chamber breathed slowly. For the first time since arriving on Starvation Ridge, Travis felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, not tension. Something else. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. He scratched Atlas behind the ears. "Well, partner," he murmured, "looks like this mountain might feed us after all." The venison hung quietly in the cool chamber beneath the mountain. For several days, Travis checked it every morning. Each time he entered the stone room, the air greeted him the same way. Steady, calm, and cool. The meat darkened slowly as the air moved through the chamber, just like the notebook had described. Atlas followed him every time. The shepherd would sit near the entrance while Travis inspected the hooks, sniffing the air as if he too were studying the mountain's strange rhythm. Outside, autumn deepened across Starvation Ridge. Golden aspen leaves fluttered down like quiet rain, gathering along the narrow path leading from the cabin into the forest. The mornings grew colder, and the wind carried a sharper edge. Travis worked steadily. He built a small smoke pit outside the stone entrance using rocks from the hillside, just as the notebook instructed. He gathered dry pine and cedar branches, testing how the smoke moved through the entrance and into the chamber. The first attempts were rough. Too much smoke made the meat bitter. Too little did nothing at all. But each evening he adjusted the fire, studying how the air currents carried the scent through the stone room. Atlas lay nearby most of the time, watching the slow process with patient curiosity. By the 6th day, the meat had changed. The color had deepened to a rich brown. The smell carried a faint sweetness from the cedar smoke. Travis cut a small strip and held it up to the light. "Moment of truth," he said quietly. Atlas stood immediately. Travis sliced the strip into 2 pieces. He tasted the first one. For a moment he said nothing. The flavor was smoky and deep, far better than the store-bought jerky he had eaten before. The texture was firm but tender enough to chew easily. Travis smiled. "Well, I'll be." He tossed the second piece to Atlas. The shepherd caught it mid-air and chewed once before swallowing. His ears perked, tail wagging. "That good, huh?" Atlas barked softly. Travis laughed, the sound echoing faintly against the cabin walls. It was the first real laugh he had let out since arriving on the ridge. Later that week, Travis drove the old pickup down the winding mountain road into town. Atlas rode in the passenger seat, watching the trees rush past the window. The town of Elk River was small enough that everyone noticed when someone new appeared, especially someone living on Starvation Ridge. Travis stopped at the general store just before noon. The bell above the door rang when he stepped inside. The place smelled like coffee, motor oil, and fresh bread. A few locals glanced up from their seats near the window. Clint Mercer stood behind the counter. Clint was a tall man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the permanent expression of someone who believed he'd seen every bad idea the mountains could produce. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw Travis. "Morning," Clint said. "Morning." Travis walked to the counter and placed a small paper-wrapped bundle down. Clint raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Venison." Clint chuckled. "You know the grocery store sells meat, right?" "This one's different." Clint unwrapped the paper slowly. Inside lay several strips of dark, smoked venison. He picked one up and sniffed it. The smell made him pause. "Where'd you get this?" "Made it." Clint studied him. "Up on that ridge?" Travis nodded. Clint took a cautious bite. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he chewed again, and again. Finally he swallowed. "Well," Clint muttered, "I'll be damned." A woman sitting near the window leaned forward. "That good?" Clint shrugged. "Taste it yourself." He passed the strip across the counter. Within seconds, 2 more locals gathered near the register. Each one tasted the smoked venison. Each one reacted the same way. Surprise first, then quiet approval. An older woman sitting near the coffee machine stood slowly and approached the counter. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and her coat looked older than most of the buildings in town. Her name was Evelyn Hart. Everyone in Elk River knew her. She had lived in the valley longer than anyone else. Clint handed her the last strip. "Tell me if I'm crazy, Evelyn." She tasted it slowly. Her eyes closed for a moment. The store grew quiet. Then she looked up at Travis. "How'd you cure this?" "Stone chamber in the mountain," Travis said. Her expression changed. "A stone chamber?" "Behind the cabin." Evelyn studied him carefully. Then she nodded once. "Your Uncle Raymond used that place." Travis blinked. "You knew him?" "Knew him well enough." She placed the empty wrapper back on the counter. "He used to trade smoked elk with my husband 40 years ago." Travis felt a strange warmth in his chest hearing that. Evelyn looked at him again. "The ridge isn't useless," she said quietly. "People just forgot how to live with it." Clint folded his arms. "Well, it still won't beat grocery trucks." Evelyn ignored him. She pointed toward the door. "You keep doing what you're doing up there." Then she smiled faintly. "Your uncle knew something the rest of us forgot." Outside the store, the mountain air felt colder than before. Travis climbed into the truck and started the engine. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat. As they drove back toward the ridge, Travis looked at the mountains rising ahead. For the first time since returning from the war, he didn't feel like the world was closing in around him. Instead, the mountains felt open, alive. Beside him, Atlas rested his head against the window, watching the forest pass by. When they reached the cabin, Travis carried the remaining venison down into the stone chamber. The hooks were beginning to fill. The air inside the mountain moved slowly through the room, just like before. Patient, steady. Atlas lay near the entrance, guarding the quiet space. Travis looked at the hanging meat and shook his head in disbelief. Just a few weeks ago, he had arrived here with nothing but a broken cabin and a war that wouldn't leave his mind. Now, the mountain was giving something back. Hope. And maybe, if the ridge kept its promises, a future. High above the valley, the wind swept across Starvation Ridge again. But this time the ridge didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waking up. Morning fog clung to the trees below Starvation Ridge, filling the valley like a quiet gray sea. The cabin sat above it all, the old boards creaking softly as the wind moved across the mountain. Travis stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee. Atlas followed close behind, stretching his long legs before sitting beside the wooden steps. His ears turned toward the forest, always listening. The ridge was quiet, but not empty anymore. Behind the cabin, inside the stone chamber carved into the mountain, rows of darkening venison hung slowly curing in the cool air. Travis had never imagined something so simple could feel so meaningful. Work. Real work. The kind that kept your hands busy and your mind steady. He had already learned one important lesson about the ridge. The mountain didn't give anything quickly. But if you were patient, it gave something back. Atlas trotted ahead toward the hillside, his nose low to the ground as he checked the same path he walked every morning. Travis watched him for a moment.
You take that guard job pretty serious, don't you?
Atlas wagged his tail once without looking back. Later that afternoon, Travis drove down into Elk River again. The road down the mountain twisted through tall pines and rocky slopes before finally dropping into the small valley town. This time he carried 2 wrapped packages of smoked venison. Inside the general store, the same small group of locals gathered near the coffee machine. They looked up when the bell over the door rang. Clint Mercer stood behind the counter again. He leaned back against the shelf, arms crossed. "Well, look who's back from the Starving Ridge." Travis placed the wrapped bundles on the counter. "Brought more." Clint glanced at the packages but didn't touch them. "You really trying to make a business out of that mountain jerky?" "It's smoked venison." Clint shrugged. "Call it whatever you want. Won't last." A man sitting near the window chuckled. "Clint's right. Grocery trucks come every week. Nobody's gonna drive up a mountain to buy meat from a cabin." Travis didn't answer right away. He simply unwrapped one of the bundles. The smell of cedar smoke filled the small store. The room grew quiet. Clint frowned slightly. Even he couldn't pretend the smell wasn't good. Evelyn Hart entered the store just then, her boots tapping slowly against the wooden floor. She walked straight to the counter. "You brought more?" Travis nodded. She picked up a strip of the smoked venison and examined it carefully. "Color's better than last time," she said. She took a bite. The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. "Getting the smoke right." Clint shook his head. "You people are acting like he invented food." Evelyn turned toward him. "No," she said calmly. "He remembered something this valley forgot." Clint scoffed. "Yeah? And what's that?" "How to survive winter without trucks." The room fell silent. Clint rolled his eyes. "We've got highways now, Evelyn. Snowplows, supply chains." He tapped the counter. "No one's starving in Elk River anymore." Evelyn said nothing. She simply wrapped the remaining venison back in paper and handed it to Travis. "Bring some by my place next week," she said. "I'll trade you fresh eggs." Travis nodded. "Deal." As he turned to leave, Clint called after him. "Don't get too comfortable up there, soldier." Travis stopped at the door. Clint leaned forward slightly. Every guy who tried living on Starvation Ridge ended up leaving before winter. A few men near the window chuckled quietly. Mountain chews people up, Clint added. Travis looked at him calmly. Guess we'll see. Outside the store, Atlas waited in the truck, his head resting on the open window frame. His tail thumped against the seat when he saw Travis. The drive back up the mountain took longer that evening. Dark clouds gathered over the peaks, and the wind grew stronger as the truck climbed the narrow road. By the time Travis reached the cabin, the sky had turned the deep blue color that came just before night. Atlas jumped down from the truck and immediately trotted toward the stone entrance behind the cabin. He sniffed the ground carefully, circling once before sitting near the doorway. Guarding. Travis smiled faintly. You're serious about that job, huh? Inside the chamber, the hanging venison swayed gently in the cool air. The mountain breathed through the narrow stone vents. Steady, patient. Travis added another piece to the row of hooks. The chamber was slowly filling. He stood back and studied the room. What had once been an abandoned cave was beginning to look like something else. A working smokehouse. A place that produced food. Food that people actually wanted. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, rattling the old cabin boards. Atlas lay near the entrance, watching the dark forest beyond the clearing. Travis stepped out beside him. The valley lights twinkled faintly far below. You hear them laughing down there? Travis said quietly. Atlas lifted his head. They think this place is useless. The dog's ears twitched. Travis scratched the shepherd behind the neck. Let him laugh. Far above the valley, cold clouds rolled slowly over the mountains. Winter was coming, and Starvation Ridge was waiting. The first snow arrived quietly. One morning, Travis stepped outside the cabin and found the ground dusted in white. Pine branches sagged slightly under the thin layer, and the wind carried the sharp scent of frozen air down from the peaks. Atlas bounded into the clearing with the kind of joy only a dog could feel when snow touched the ground. He dove nose first into the powder, snorting and tossing it into the air. Travis leaned against the porch railing with his coffee and watched him. You like it, huh? Atlas sprinted across the clearing and slid sideways, sending a spray of snow behind him. The ridge felt different now. Colder. Still. The kind of quiet that comes when the mountains prepare for something bigger. Over the next 2 weeks, the snow deepened. Not much at first, just a few inches every few days, but the air stayed cold and the wind carried new clouds across the peaks. Travis spent most of his time preparing. He cut firewood and stacked it under the porch roof. He repaired cracks in the cabin walls with old boards and insulation he found in the shed. But most of his work happened behind the cabin. The stone chamber inside the mountain was nearly full now. Rows of smoked venison hung from the hooks. Strips of dried meat rested on racks along the walls. Atlas followed him each day while he worked, his thick coat growing heavier as winter settled over the ridge. One afternoon, Travis drove down into Elk River again. The road was already becoming harder to navigate. Snow packed into the narrow turns, and the wind pushed powder across the path like drifting sand. When he reached town, the general store was busy. People moved quickly between shelves, loading carts with canned food, bread, and bottled water. Clint Mercer stood near the register, shaking his head. "Storm coming," he said to anyone who would listen. "How bad?" someone asked. "Big one." Travis walked to the counter. Clint glanced up. "Well, look who survived the ridge so far." Travis placed a small bundle of smoked venison on the counter. Clint looked at it, but didn't smile this time. "You stocking up too?" "No." Travis nodded toward the windows. "You expecting the roads to close?" Clint shrugged. "Depends how hard it hits." An older man sitting near the coffee machine spoke up. "They're saying it could be the biggest storm in decades." Clint waved him off. "People say that every winter." But his voice didn't sound quite as confident. Outside, the wind had begun to rise. The clouds rolling over the mountains looked darker now. Travis didn't stay long. He bought a few extra supplies and drove back toward the ridge before the storm could begin. By the time he reached the cabin, snow had started falling again. This time, it didn't stop. The first night, the wind howled across Starvation Ridge like something alive. Snow slammed against the cabin walls in waves. Atlas paced near the door, his ears twitching with every sharp sound the storm made. Travis sat beside the wood stove, feeding the fire slowly. The storm reminded him of something. The sound of wind pounding the cabin felt too much like distant explosions echoing through mountains overseas. His breathing grew heavier. Atlas noticed immediately. The shepherd walked over and placed his head against Travis's leg. The simple contact pulled Travis back from the memory. He rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, buddy." Atlas stayed there until the storm outside faded into the background again. Morning brought no sunlight, only more snow. The valley below had disappeared completely beneath a swirling white sky. Travis stepped outside and immediately sank nearly to his knees. The truck was buried halfway in snow. The road down the mountain was gone. Atlas stood beside him, scanning the silent forest. The ridge was cut off now. No trucks, no roads, no town. Just the cabin, the mountain, and the endless storm. For the next several days, the blizzard continued. The wind roared day and night. Trees groaned under the weight of snow. But inside the mountain chamber, the air remained calm, cool, steady. The meat hanging on the hooks stayed perfectly preserved. Travis began using the sled he had built weeks earlier. He loaded it with bundles of smoked venison and dried meat. Then he tied the rope around his shoulders. Atlas ran ahead through the snow, breaking a path. Their first trip down the ridge took nearly 4 hours. The valley town looked different when they arrived. Snow piled against the buildings. The grocery store windows were dark. Inside, shelves that had once held fresh food were nearly empty. Clint Mercer stood behind the counter looking tired. When Travis walked in, dragging the sled behind him, every head turned. Bundles of smoked meat filled the sled. For a moment, no one spoke. Clint stepped around the counter slowly. "You hauled all that down from the ridge?" Travis nodded. "Thought people might need it." Silence spread across the store. Finally, Evelyn Hart stepped forward. She looked at the sled, then at Travis. "I told you," she said softly. "The ridge remembers how to feed people." One by one, the townspeople gathered around. For the first time since the storm began, the room smelled like food again. Clint looked at Travis, the old skepticism gone from his face. "Looks like that useless mountain of yours might be worth something after all." Outside, the blizzard still raged across the valley. But inside the store, something had changed. The man everyone had laughed at was now the one bringing food into town. And beside him, Atlas stood proudly in the snow, his thick fur dusted white, watching over the sled like a soldier guarding his supply line. For a moment, no one in the store moved. Snow battered the windows, and the wind howled outside like a living thing trying to claw its way inside. The shelves behind the counter looked emptier than Travis remembered. Clint Mercer rubbed the back of his neck and looked down at the sled. "How much you got there?" "Enough for a few days," Travis said. The room filled with the smell of cedar smoke and cured meat. People gathered slowly around the sled, not rushing, not pushing, just staring with quiet relief. Evelyn Hart reached down first and lifted one of the wrapped bundles. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from weakness, from understanding. "You carried this down the ridge, in this storm?" Travis nodded. "With help." Atlas stood beside him, tail low but steady. The dog's chest rose slowly with each breath as he watched the people around the sled. Evelyn crouched and gently scratched behind his ears. "Good boy," she whispered. For the next hour, Travis helped divide the smoked meat between families in town. No one argued. No one tried to take more than their share. They knew how bad the storm was. They knew the roads might stay closed for weeks. Clint handed Travis a small sack filled with canned beans and bread. "Trade," Clint muttered. Travis nodded once. Outside, the blizzard had grown worse. The snow blew sideways across the street, erasing footprints within seconds. By the time Travis tied the empty sled behind him again, daylight had already begun fading into the blue shadows of evening. Evelyn stepped closer to him. "You staying in town tonight?" Travis shook his head. "Cabin's stocked, fire's burning." She glanced at the sky.
That ridge gets dangerous in storms like this.
"I know." Atlas barked softly, as if agreeing. Travis tightened the rope around his shoulders and started back toward the mountain road. Atlas ran ahead, breaking a narrow path through the deep snow. The climb back to Starvation Ridge took longer than usual. The wind had shifted. Snowdrifts formed along the narrow road, forcing Travis to detour through sections of forest where the snow wasn't as deep. Atlas stayed ahead the entire time, checking the ground and circling back to make sure Travis followed. By the time they reached the upper ridge, darkness had settled across the mountains. The storm roared louder here. Trees bent under the weight of snow and wind. The cabin light glowed faintly through the storm when they finally reached the clearing. Travis untied the rope from his shoulders and leaned against the porch railing, breathing heavily. "Made it." Atlas trotted into the clearing first. Then suddenly the dog froze. His ears snapped forward, low, alert. Travis recognized that posture instantly. The kind Atlas used in Afghanistan when something dangerous moved nearby. "What is it?" Atlas growled softly. The sound was deep and warning. The wind howled around them, carrying snow through the trees. Then Travis heard it. A sound beneath the wind. A low, rasping growl. From the tree line. The mountain lion stepped into the clearing like a shadow made of muscle and fur. Its coat blended perfectly with the snowy forest behind it. Yellow eyes locked onto Travis. The animal had likely been driven down the mountain by the storm. Hungry. Desperate. Atlas moved forward immediately, positioning himself between the predator and his owner. "Atlas." The lion crouched. Then it launched forward. Everything happened in seconds. Atlas leapt to meet it. The two animals collided in a violent burst of snow and fur. Travis raised his rifle but couldn't get a clear shot.
The mountain lion clawed downward, its massive weight driving Atlas into the snow. Atlas twisted, biting at the lion's neck, forcing the predator sideways. The two animals rolled across the clearing. Snow exploded around them. Travis stepped closer, heart pounding. "Atlas!" The lion lunged again. Atlas intercepted it, taking the hit. The shepherd's body slammed against the predator, buying Travis a split second. This time, the rifle found its mark. The shot cracked through the storm. The mountain lion collapsed into the snow. Silence followed. The wind howled again, filling the clearing. Atlas lay several feet away, not moving. Travis dropped the rifle and ran to him. "Hey! Hey!" The dog lifted his head slowly. A deep gash cut across his shoulder, staining the snow dark beneath him. Travis swallowed hard. "You stubborn idiot!" Atlas tried to stand but faltered. Travis slid his arms under the dog carefully and lifted him. The shepherd weighed nearly 90 pounds, but Travis carried him like a wounded soldier. Inside the cabin, he laid Atlas beside the stove. The dog's breathing was shallow. Travis moved quickly. Old habits from combat medicine returned. He grabbed the field kit he kept in his pack. Clean cloth, needle, thread. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was deep. Atlas didn't make a sound while Travis worked. Not a whine, not a cry. Only quiet breathing. When the stitches were finished, Travis wrapped the shoulder tightly with bandages. He sat beside the dog for a long time after. The storm outside continued without mercy. But inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. Atlas rested his head on Travis's boot. Alive. Exhausted, but alive. Travis stared at the dog and shook his head slowly. "You always did like jumping into trouble." Atlas's tail thumped weakly once against the wooden floor. Outside, snow continued piling against the cabin walls. Inside the mountain chamber, rows of smoked meat hung quietly in the cold stone air. And beside the fire, the dog who had saved Travis more than once in war had just done it again. Only this time, the battle had been fought on Starvation Ridge. The storm did not end the next morning, or the morning after that. For 3 days the wind screamed across the mountain without mercy, burying the cabin deeper beneath drifting snow. The world outside became a white blur where distance vanished and sound traveled strangely through the storm. Inside the cabin, the fire never went out. Travis slept in short stretches beside the stove, waking every hour to check Atlas. The dog lay on a thick blanket near the warmth, his shoulder wrapped carefully in clean bandages. The wound looked angry and swollen, but the bleeding had stopped. Each time Atlas opened his eyes, he looked straight at Travis, as if making sure his partner was still there. "You're gonna be all right," Travis told him more than once. Atlas answered with a slow wag of his tail. By the 4th morning, the storm finally weakened. The wind fell quiet first. Then the snow slowed until only a few flakes drifted through the air. When Travis opened the cabin door, the ridge had disappeared beneath a mountain of snow. The clearing looked unfamiliar. The truck was buried completely. The path to the stone chamber behind the cabin had vanished beneath drifts nearly waist deep. Atlas stood carefully, testing his injured shoulder. "Easy," Travis said. The dog limped slightly, but remained determined to follow. Together they moved through the deep snow toward the stone entrance. It took nearly 20 minutes to dig their way down to the door. Inside the mountain chamber, nothing had changed. The cool air remained steady. Rows of smoked venison hung from the hooks, preserved perfectly in the natural cold. The sight of it filled Travis with a strange mix of relief and responsibility. The valley below had no food trucks, no deliveries, and the storm had likely hit the town just as hard. Atlas sat near the entrance, watching quietly while Travis studied the hanging meat. "Well, partner," Travis said slowly, "looks like we've got work to do." The next hour was spent preparing the sled. Travis packed bundles of smoked venison and dried meat carefully into canvas sacks. He tied them down with rope so the load wouldn't shift during the long descent. Atlas watched the entire process. When Travis finished, the sled carried nearly 200 pounds of food. He slipped the rope harness over his shoulders. Atlas stepped forward immediately. Even with the injured shoulder, the dog took his position ahead of the sled like he had done many times before. "Don't overdo it," Travis said quietly. Atlas flicked his ears back as if acknowledging the warning. The descent down Starvation Ridge was slow and exhausting. Snow reached nearly to Travis's thighs in places. The sled dragged heavily behind him, its runners scraping through the frozen drifts. Atlas moved ahead through the snow like a silent guide, breaking a narrow path between the trees. Every so often, he would stop and look back to make sure Travis was still following. The journey took most of the day. By the time they reached the valley road, the sun had begun dropping behind the mountains. Elk River looked different. Snow buried the streets and sidewalks. The grocery store sign creaked in the cold wind. Inside the store, the shelves were nearly empty. People stood quietly near the counter, speaking in low voices. When the door opened and Travis stepped inside, dragging the loaded sled, the room fell silent. Atlas walked beside him, his fur dusted with snow. Clint Mercer stared at the sled. "You've got to be kidding me." Travis untied one of the sacks and opened it. The smell of smoked venison filled the room again. A woman near the back covered her mouth in relief. "Is that meat?" Travis nodded.
"Got more up on the ridge." Clint ran a hand over his face. "The truck still can't get through the pass." Evelyn Hart stepped forward slowly. Her eyes moved from Travis to Atlas. "Your dog's hurt." "Mountain lion," Travis said. Atlas stood quietly despite the attention. Evelyn crouched beside him. "You still came down the mountain like this?" Travis shrugged. "People need food." For a moment, the room remained completely still. Then Clint cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered, "guess the mountain man's supply line is open." Travis began dividing the food between families. No one argued. No one complained. Every household received something. Smoked venison, dried meat, enough to last until the next delivery, whenever that might come. By the time the sled was empty, the store felt different. Warmer somehow. Clint leaned against the counter and shook his head slowly. "You know," he said, "I spent 20 years telling people that ridge was useless." He looked at Travis. "Turns out, it's the only place in the valley that still has food." Travis glanced down at Atlas. The dog sat beside him, tired but alert. Outside, the storm clouds finally began to break apart over the mountains. High above the valley, Starvation Ridge stood quiet beneath the snow. For generations, people had called it barren, worthless, a place that produced nothing. But now, in the hardest winter the valley had seen in 40 years, that same ridge had become something else entirely. It had become the place that kept Elk River alive. And at the center of it all stood a quiet veteran and the loyal dog who had found the mountain's secret. For nearly 3 weeks, the valley remained cut off from the outside world. Snow packed the mountain roads like solid walls of ice. Even the county plows couldn't reach Elk River. The pass beyond the valley stayed buried under drifts taller than trucks. But the town did not starve. Every 2 days, Travis returned from Starvation Ridge with the sled. Sometimes he carried smoked venison, sometimes dried elk. Other times, strips of cured rabbit or bundles of jerky that had finished aging in the cold stone chamber behind his cabin. And every time he arrived, Atlas came with him. The dog's shoulder healed slowly, but the scar beneath his fur remained visible. Even injured, Atlas insisted on walking beside the sled, breaking trails through the snow when Travis grew too tired. The townspeople noticed. At first, they spoke quietly about it. Then they spoke openly. People began waiting for the sound of the sled runners scraping against the frozen road. When that sound came, it meant food had arrived again. One afternoon, as Travis entered the general store with another load, Clint Mercer shook his head in disbelief. "You know something?" Clint said. "What's that?" "I used to think Starvation Ridge was the worst piece of land in the county." He gestured toward the sled. "Now I'm thinking it might be the smartest land anyone ever owned." Several people in the store chuckled softly. Evelyn Hart stepped forward and placed a small basket in Travis's hands. "Fresh eggs." "I told you," she said gently. "Your uncle understood the mountain." Travis looked down at the basket and smiled. Atlas sat quietly beside him, watching the room with calm eyes. The storm outside had faded days ago, but winter still gripped the valley tightly. Snow covered every rooftop and road. Smoke rose steadily from the chimneys of nearly every house. For the first time since the blizzard began, the town felt alive again. Not desperate, not afraid. Alive. A week later, something unusual happened. Instead of waiting for Travis to come down the mountain, people began climbing the ridge themselves. At first, it was just one man. Then two. Then a small group. They followed the narrow trail Travis had carved through the snow with the sled. When they reached the cabin, they stood quietly in the clearing. The cabin looked different now. The porch had been repaired, the woodpile stacked neatly beside the wall. And behind the cabin, smoke curled gently from the small pit outside the stone chamber. Atlas noticed them first. He barked once, then wagged his tail when he recognized the scent of the valley. Travis stepped out of the stone chamber with a bundle of venison in his hands. He stopped when he saw the visitors. Clint Mercer stood near the front of the group. Behind him were several families from town. "We figured it was time we saw the place ourselves," Clint said. Travis nodded slowly. "Well, here it is." Evelyn Hart stepped forward carefully, studying the ridge around them. Snow covered the slopes and trees in every direction. The wind moved gently across the mountain, carrying the scent of pine and cedar smoke. "It's quieter up here than I remember," she said. Atlas walked slowly among the visitors, letting children scratch behind his ears. Clint looked toward the stone entrance behind the cabin. "That where the magic happens?" Travis chuckled. "No magic." He motioned for them to follow. Inside the stone chamber, the temperature dropped immediately. The townspeople stepped carefully into the room, their breath visible in the cool air. Rows of smoked meat hung from the hooks along the walls. Racks of drying venison rested beneath them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the men whispered softly, "Good Lord." Clint turned slowly in place, studying the chamber. "You've got enough food here to feed half the valley." "Not half," Travis said. "Most of it." The words hung quietly in the air. Evelyn walked toward the stone wall and touched it with her hand. "The mountain's breathing," she said. Some of the others looked confused. She pointed toward the narrow vent carved into the rock above them. "Cold air moves through the stone. That's what keeps it steady." Travis nodded. "That's how it works." Clint shook his head slowly. "All these years." He laughed softly. All these years, we called this place Starvation Ridge. Atlas walked over and sat beside Travis. The dog's ears flicked toward the chamber entrance as wind whispered faintly outside. For a long moment, the townspeople simply stood there, listening, feeling the quiet, cold air of the mountain. Finally, Clint spoke again. "You know what this means, right?" Travis looked at him. Clint gestured toward the rows of meat. "This place isn't just feeding the valley during a storm." He paused. "This place could feed it every winter." The idea settled slowly across the room. A few people exchanged glances. Others nodded quietly. Outside the chamber, the mountain wind moved gently across the ridge. The storm had passed, but something else had begun. Starvation Ridge was no longer the place people avoided. It was becoming the place they depended on. And standing in the center of it all, with Atlas quietly guarding the chamber door, Travis Cole realized something he had not felt since long before the war. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He belonged here. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Elk River. The snow didn't disappear all at once. Instead, it melted in quiet stages. First the roofs cleared, then the roads began showing thin ribbons of dark pavement beneath the ice. Finally, the river itself broke open, carrying shards of snow and frozen branches downstream. Life in the valley returned piece by piece. Supply trucks eventually made it through the mountain pass again, rumbling into town with crates of groceries and fuel. The shelves inside Clint Mercer's store filled back up with canned goods and packaged meat. But something had changed. People still drove up Starvation Ridge, even after the roads reopened. The trail Travis had carved through the snow during the blizzard had turned into a proper path now.
Tire tracks and boot prints climbed the mountain every few days. Some visitors came simply to see the place that had fed the valley. Others came because they wanted to learn. On a mild spring afternoon, a white pickup truck rolled slowly into the clearing beside the cabin. Atlas noticed it first. The German shepherd lifted his head from the porch steps, ears forward. His injured shoulder had healed well, though the scar beneath his fur remained as a reminder of the winter fight. Travis stepped out of the stone chamber, wiping his hands on a rag. The man who climbed out of the truck wore a brown field jacket and carried a clipboard. "Travis Cole?" "That's me." The man walked closer, studying the ridge around them. "My name's Daniel Foster," he said. "Colorado Agricultural Extension." Travis raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know the government cared about smoked venison." Daniel smiled slightly. "Normally we don't." He pointed toward the stone entrance behind the cabin. "But what you've got inside that mountain caught someone's attention." A few weeks earlier, Clint Mercer had told a traveling truck driver about the ridge that fed an entire valley during the worst storm in decades. The story had traveled farther than anyone expected. Daniel followed Travis inside the stone chamber. The cool air wrapped around them immediately. Rows of curing meat hung from the hooks, filling the chamber with the deep scent of cedar smoke and mountain air. Daniel stopped in the center of the room and looked around slowly. "Well, I'll be." He walked toward the stone wall and pressed his hand against it. "Temperature's steady," he muttered. Then he examined the narrow ventilation slit carved into the rock above. "How deep does this chamber run into the mountain?" "About 20 feet." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "And the temperature stays like this year-round?" "Pretty close." Daniel flipped open his clipboard. "I've been studying natural cold air systems in the Rockies for years," he said. "But I've never seen one used quite like this." He turned toward Travis. "Your uncle built this?"
Looks that way. Daniel walked slowly through the chamber again, studying the rock formations carefully. The geology here is unusual, he said. Travis leaned against the stone wall. How so? Daniel pointed toward the upper vent. Cold air from higher elevations moves through cracks in the mountain. When it passes through these stone layers, the temperature stabilizes. He tapped the rock gently. It creates a natural refrigeration system. Atlas sat quietly near the entrance, watching the two men. Daniel smiled at the dog. Smart animal, he said. Found this place? Sure did. Daniel wrote something down on his clipboard. You realize what this means, right? Travis shrugged. Means the mountain keeps meat cold. Daniel laughed softly. It means this ridge may be one of the best natural curing environments in the entire state. Travis folded his arms. Didn't see that coming. Daniel nodded. Neither did anyone else, apparently. He walked back toward the chamber entrance and looked out at the mountains stretching across the horizon. You've got the right altitude, the right rock formation, and the right airflow. People spend thousands of dollars building artificial curing rooms that try to mimic conditions like this. He glanced back toward the rows of meat. You've got it naturally. Outside the chamber, the wind moved gently through the pines. Atlas trotted ahead as the two men stepped into the sunlight again. Daniel looked across the ridge. Most people think land is valuable only if it grows crops, he said. But sometimes the value is hidden in something else. He pointed toward the mountain. Your ridge isn't barren. It's rare. Travis stood quietly for a moment. For years, people in Elk River had laughed at Starvation Ridge.
They called it useless. A place where nothing could grow. A place no one wanted. Now the same ridge had fed the entire valley during the worst winter anyone could remember. Daniel climbed back into his truck. Before closing the door, he looked at Travis one more time. If you ever decide to expand what you're doing here, he said, you might want to give it a name. Travis glanced toward the stone chamber entrance. Atlas sat proudly beside it, watching the valley below. The wind carried the smell of pine and distant snowmelt across the ridge. Travis smiled faintly. I think the ridge already named itself. Daniel started the engine. The truck rolled slowly down the mountain road. And for the first time in generations, Starvation Ridge was no longer known as the place where nothing grew. It was becoming known as the place where something remarkable had been hiding all along. Spring turned the valley green again. Snow melted from the slopes in quiet streams that ran down through the forest, feeding Elk River as it wound through the town below. The heavy silence of winter gave way to the sounds of birds returning to the mountains and the rustle of fresh leaves in the aspens. Starvation Ridge looked different now. Not empty, not forgotten, alive. The old cabin had changed too. Travis spent the early months of spring repairing the structure properly. New beams replaced the weakest boards, and a wider porch stretched across the front of the cabin where the sled once rested after long trips down the mountain. Behind the cabin, the stone chamber remained the heart of everything. The smoke pit outside had been rebuilt with stronger rock walls, and racks of curing meat filled the chamber once again as hunting season returned. But what surprised Travis most was how often people came to visit. Not out of curiosity anymore, out of respect. Families from Elk River climbed the ridge during the warmer months. Some came to help cut firewood, others helped repair fences or carry supplies up the mountain road. And nearly everyone stopped to greet Atlas. The German Shepherd had become something of a legend in the valley. Children ran ahead when they reached the clearing, calling the dog's name before they even saw the cabin. Atlas always greeted them the same way, standing tall beside the porch, tail wagging slowly, watching over the ridge like a quiet guardian. His shoulder had healed well. Only the faint scar beneath his thick fur hinted at the winter fight that had nearly taken his life. One afternoon late in the summer, Travis stood beside the smoke pit checking a rack of venison while the warm mountain wind drifted across the ridge. Atlas lay nearby in the grass, his head resting on his paws as he watched the valley far below. The dog was older now, not old enough to slow down completely, but older than when they first arrived on the ridge. Travis wiped his hands and sat down beside him. "You remember that storm?" he asked quietly. Atlas lifted his head slightly. "Whole valley nearly ran out of food." The dog's ears twitched as the wind carried distant sounds up from the town. Travis scratched behind the shepherd's ears. "You're the one who found it, you know." Atlas thumped his tail once against the grass. The stone chamber behind the cabin breathed softly with the mountain air moving through its vents. What had once been an abandoned cold storage cave was now the center of something much larger. Travis had given it a name: Coal Ridge Smokehouse. The sign stood near the trail leading up to the cabin, carved into a thick plank of pine wood. Travelers passing through Elk River had begun stopping to buy smoked venison and elk before continuing through the mountains. Some even drove hours out of their way just to visit the ridge that had fed a valley during the worst storm anyone could remember. But Travis had added something else beside the sign. A smaller wooden plaque rested just beneath it. The words carved into it were simple. Atlas found the mountain. Travis Cole fed the valley. Late in the afternoon, when the sun dropped low behind the peaks, the ridge grew quiet again. The same wind that once howled during the blizzard now moved gently through the tall grass. Below the ridge, the valley lights began flickering on as evening settled over Elk River. Travis leaned back against the porch railing and watched the mountains darken in the fading light. Atlas climbed slowly onto the porch beside him and lay down near the steps. For a while, neither of them moved. The war that once lived inside Travis's mind had grown quieter here. The mountains had given him something he never expected to find again: purpose, peace, and a place that felt like home. As the last light faded behind the peaks, Atlas lifted his head one final time and looked out across the valley. The same valley they had helped feed during the coldest winter in decades. Travis rested his hand on the dog's back. "Good work, partner," he said softly. The wind swept gently across Starvation Ridge, and somewhere deep inside the mountain, the cold stone chamber continued doing what it had done for generations. Waiting, patient, ready for the next winter that might come. But this time, the valley knew exactly where its food and its hope would be found. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Just type 1 in the comments if you believe loyalty like Atlas's still exists in this world. Or type 0 if this story reminded you of someone brave you once knew. And if you're watching from somewhere out there in the world tonight, tell us where you're watching from. This community loves seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Because out there in the mountains, forests, and quiet towns across America, there are still many powerful stories waiting to be told. And the next one might just be even more unforgettable.